So about 2 years ago, I set out to investigate the science of why we're socially awkward. And along the way, I found something kind of unexpected, which was that the same traits that make people socially awkward are the same psychological characteristics that can power them towards extraordinary achievements. Now, I think everybody here knows what it's like to be awkward every now and then. You can probably think of some of your finest awkward moments. When we have an awkward moment, it's defined simply as a deviation from a minor social expectation. Things like maintaining 18 inches of personal space, or zipping your zipper. And if you can remember the last time you forgot to zip your zipper for a prolonged period of time, maybe at a party or at work, you can remember what the emotional reaction was like. You blushed, your heart started racing, your muscles started to tense, and that's because your mind was telling you you should be alarmed. You stepped outside of the social bounds, and you should try to correct your behavior. So awkward moments actually serve a nice function to keep us in line with everybody else and keep us getting along. Now, there's a difference between having an awkward moment every now and then and being an awkward person. So people who are socially awkward, they have trouble with routine social situations. Things like ordering at a restaurant or understanding the unspoken choreography of where to stand in a crowded elevator. And I can have some empathy, actually, for awkward people because, surprise, surprise, I am socially awkward. When I started writing the book, Awkward, I told friends and family I was writing this book about the science of social awkwardness, and I like to joke, or I thought I was joking, that it was going to be a memoir, and they never really laughed. They just kind of shake like, yeah, that makes perfect sense that you would do that, so good work, Ty. Now, you got to know that social life turned out better than I expected. So it's okay if we have a few laughs at my awkward history. And what better place to start than the time that was probably peak awkwardness for most of us, middle school. Now, as middle school approached for me, I had this sense from my Judy Blume books and my friends, older siblings, that the social complexity of junior high was going to be too much for my limited social skill. So I started to formulate a strategic plan. After weeks of deliberation, I decided that my social success in junior high school would rely on a more mature and professional Tashiro. Now, I'm not sure why I thought maturity and professionalism would pave the way to social success, but as you can imagine, this led to a number of misguided social choices. For example, when I went shopping for new eyeglasses, I rejected the salesperson's wise advice to get cooler frames like aviators or Wayfarer-shaped frames, and instead, opted for this pair of bifocal-like frames. When we went shopping for a school bag, I once again rejected wise advice to get the traditional backpack. Instead, got a brown briefcase-like satchel. When the first day of school came, I paired these marvelous accessories with a starched blue Oxford shirt and a crisp pair of khaki pants. Now, if I'd been a 40-year-old professor, I may have looked dashing, but at the time, it was a poor social choice, and it was just the first of many. I was bewildered by social life. I didn't understand social expectations. I didn't understand the hundreds of social cues that you have to process in any given day. And I had a hard time grasping the behaviors that would actually be socially acceptable. I was obviously trying too hard to fit in to junior high school. And I was trying too hard to be unique in order to be a part of the crowd. And that's actually something that happens to all of us, probably in less dramatic ways, but something that happens to all of us in middle school. Sometimes we wonder, why was middle school peak awkwardness? Well, there's a lot of psychological forces that are developing rapidly right around the same time. On the one hand, you feel this psychological urge to individuate, to be your own person and be a bit of a rebel. And we know that if we are unique, that's a social value, but we also know that if we step too far outside of the social bounds, we might become so much of an outsider that we risk being ostracized. Now, on the other hand, we're really motivated to fit in, As humans, around middle school, we start to get these abstract capabilities to think about things like cliques and social groups. And so we know there's things like jocks and punks and geeks, and we want to get into the group that has the most social power. And it's because we have this fundamental need to belong as human beings. So it's understandable. But the social expectations that humans had to meet for thousands of years were much different than the social expectations we have now. For most of human history, we were in small hunter-gatherer groups, and we needed to know, for example, whether the people around us were fair. Were they going to divide the hunted and gathered foods in an even way so that we could all survive and live? We wanted to know if people would be loyal during times of battle or adversity. And when we fell upon hard times, because there was so little room for error during most of human history, we hoped that people might be kind and generous. These were the expectations that we were evolved to have as humans to help us work cooperatively together and to support one another. These days, social expectations have gotten a little strange, I think. We obsess about things like the sleekness of our phone or the skinniness of our jeans. And while there's nothing wrong with having a phone or pants, the problem arises when we make this the priority, when we make temporary social expectations and goods the kind of currency that we trade in with one another. And when we do that, life can start to feel a little bit empty and a little bit meaningless. You know, it's not just kids and teens that are faced with this struggle to find fulfillment in life and to find meaning. It's also adults as well. You know, there's a lot of data to suggest that adults are struggling to find fulfillment in modern-day social life. A recent Gallup poll found that over half of adults feel disengaged at work. Another study found that about 33% of adults don't have a leisure interest or a hobby that they enjoy. And this broad sense of cultural malaise has also seeped in to our social lives, where we have more connections than we ever did before, but we have fewer meaningful relationships and find it harder to form a deep connection with the people that we care about the most. You know, maybe it's the case that we've become a bit misguided and focused on social expectations and social cues that don't really matter. And maybe we need to return to things that are a little bit more meaningful. Now, this notion that we're all trying to fit into standard social molds and it's kind of uncomfortable, it's hard to see why that's the case. And so why don't we take a look at people who naturally have a hard time fitting into social molds, and that's awkward people. So let's take a look at the psychology of what it means to be socially awkward. Now, a socially awkward person, to define that, I like to look at the root of the word, which is an Old Norse word, afugur, and that means facing a different direction. And I really like that definition because it maps on well to the cognitive science and clinical science about why awkward people might miss social expectations that everybody else sees, but it also suggests a potential upside, which is that they might be looking at something unique and useful. Now, there's a quick analogy that's helpful to think about a lot of this science. Imagine that there's a stage, and let's say it's broadly illuminated. You could see everything that happens. You could see people enter stage left or exit stage right. You could gather the social context surrounding the action, but you would spend most of your time looking center stage, because that's where most of the key interactions will take place. And that's how most people see the social world unfold. Now, awkward people, by comparison, see that same stage not broadly illuminated, but spotlighted. And to make things interesting, that spotlight tends to fall a little left of center. So that means they're going to miss a lot of the key social information that's taking place, but they're going to have this brilliant perspective on an unusual part of the interactions and of the plot. Now, this same spotlighted perspective can be put to good use and actually help them out. Because there's a question that comes up with, if awkward people aren't looking the same place everyone else is looking, well, then what are they looking at? You know, when I was a kid, about 7 or 8 years old, my spotlight fell on something pretty unusual for a kid of that age, statistics. So, my childhood is pretty much like Friday Night Lights. My dad was a coach and athletic director in our small town at the high school. And so at the games, I could have sat anywhere I wanted. I could have sat with the coaches or with the players, even the cheerleaders. But I instead chose to sit by the scorekeeper's table. And I would ask the scorekeepers a million questions. I was fascinated with this idea that they could quantify something as hectic as a basketball game. And then the coaches could take those numbers and help the players work together in a more efficient and cooperative way. I was so obsessed with it that I would spend hours upon hours analyzing the data when I got home. And while this was a great interest, it's not the kind of thing that makes you cool at school, I can say. Now, I was so interested in this notion of data that I started reading the sports pages for other sports to see how statistics were logged there, and would wake up early every morning to scour through the statistics. I also learned I had an unusual memory for numbers. And I would love it when the coaches turned to me on the bus and asked me about a player's points or shooting percentage, and I could just recite it off the top of my head. It was early signs of some things that I might enjoy doing later on, and the kind of enthusiasm and interest I had for it was certainly unusual. I also realized around that same time that my friends who were awkward peers of mine, we had a lot in common. And the one thing that we had in common was that we were all extremely enthusiastic about things that were decidedly uncool. We like things like Dungeons and Dragons. My awkward people are here, thank you, yeah. They're all sitting in the same place, too. Marching with clarinets, amazing. And participating in mathematics competitions. Math, well represented, all right. I feel right at home, thank you, you're a great crowd. It was that same enthusiasm that would be so important later in life for me. And I think the thing that really bothers me now, these days, about this kind of culture of cool, this pressure on kids and teens to fit these standard social molds, is that it robs them of the things that they're most passionate and enthusiastic about. I think that's one of the great strengths that awkward people have, is that they really love what they love. And they have a tremendous focus on things that they love. And it's as if they move their spotlight in a linear kind of fashion from one detail to the next to understand things. And in fact, there's a lot of data in social science to suggest that awkward people do have the spotlighted focus. And they tend to gravitate toward fields of study and college majors that are very systematic and rule-governed. Things like computer science or mathematics, even things like ballet, where mastery of details is essential to eventual mastery and even greatness. In closing, I want to talk about a psychological characteristic that I never captured in those stat sheets as a kid, a characteristic that is essential to achieving your personal potential and for us to achieve the potential of our teams or even our societies. About 2 years ago at a press conference, Gino Auriemma, who's the head basketball coach at UConn for the women's basketball team, who's arguably one of the greatest, probably the greatest coach in the history of college basketball, was asked, what's the secret ingredient to the success behind your unbelievable run of national championships? Coach Auriemma looked the reporter straight in the eye, and he said, with great intensity, we recruit enthusiastic kids. To him, there was nothing more important than to have kids who have a pure love for the game, who are unafraid to let other people see that, and who have an understanding that a sharp attention to details eventually adds up to greatness. If you take one thing away from today, whether you're awkward or not awkward, I think it's that we're at our best when we're our most enthusiastic. If you think about the times in your life when you achieved the closest to your potential or even beyond your potential, it was when you were passionate and in love with something so much that you would persist and be determined and obsess over every small detail until you assembled those into something that was brilliant and spectacular. Thanks so much.